I'm going to be discussing the war in Iran this morning, and uh, the the place that I want to start in this discussion is with a recognition that human beings are being maimed and killed right now in Iran as well as in other countries in the surrounding region because of U.S. and Israeli military aggression. That's the driver of this war. This is an imperialist war. It is an aggressive war. It is an illegal war. And thousands of people are dead, and at least thousands more, possibly far, far more than that, are being injured. Many of them will be in pain, disabled, and uh, 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 dealing with the consequences of this war for the rest of their lives. And we're not even a week into this conflict. So I want to start with a recognition of that, of the human cost, and also of the non-human cost of war. Because as we know, the US military is the biggest polluter on the planet. It's the source of more carbon emissions than any other single entity on Earth. And if you look at the fighter jets crisscrossing across the Middle East right now, the missiles that are being fired, the carrier strike groups that are out in the ocean, these are some of the most ecologically destructive technologies that have ever been created. So I want to, again, just begin by acknowledging the human cost of the war and the non-human cost of the war, because people are dying right now. People are getting their limbs blown off. They're losing their eyes. They're losing their hearing permanently. And that cannot be understated, the importance of that, and just the human cost of war like this. I don't know about the rest of you, depending on your age, but I'm having a lot of flashbacks right now to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq that happened in 2001 and 2003. It's like we're in that time again. It's like we're right back there in the wake of 9/11 with these tepid, half-baked lies being told to the public, to the media, about why this war is taking place. People probably remember Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld going to the United Nations and lying about yellow cake, about WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and creating the case for war that went on to kill 1 million people. That was the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq resulted in the deaths of more than 1 million people in the region, both directly killed in the conflict and who died as a result of increased mortality rates because the water treatment plants got blown up, the hospitals got blown up, basic infrastructure went down, and people had to live with that reality or die with it, as the case went. So, people are saying that they're old enough to remember the lies that got the U.S. into Vietnam, of course, the Gulf of Tonkin. We've seen this over and over again. I'm going to bring in my friend Justin. We did a live stream a couple weeks ago, more focused purely on ecological issues. But the reality is that the ecological issues and the issues of imperialism and war are the same issue. They are the same issue, and we separate them out into these different domains at our own peril, because not only the forces that drive these imperialist wars. Hey, Justin, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Max.
My thought, and then I'll say hi and welcome you in. But the forces that drive this imperialist destruction are also driving the ecological destruction. The same imperatives underlie this. So good morning, Justin. I'm glad you could join me. I know you were up late working last night, so you're probably a little tired, but I mean, I'm probably going to swear a lot on this podcast because this is it's a fucked up situation. Like, this is so fucked up, Netanyahu, the war criminal, genocidal maniac, has been trying to bring the U.S. into invading Iran for decades, literally for decades, has been trying to bribe, cajole, blackmail, force, beg, plead with U.S. administrations to invade Iran, bomb Iran, bomb Iran, bomb Iran. And no one was stupid enough to do it until the Trump administration came along. So obviously, I
That's
have a lot of strong feelings about this, Justin. I don't know if you want to say anything as we get started here. Good morning again.
well, it is amazing that Iran has been 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon for since, like, the 1990s.
Yeah.
So, that is remarkable, and that's the justification, of course, that
Yeah.
we hear.
Yeah. Yeah. And, like people will talk about the Iranian regime being an oppressive regime, right? Killing
Sure.
people, cracking down on freedom of speech. And, this is that reality is true, right? We can't like I have a friend who spent 2 years in an Iranian prison, right? And
Oh,
he
wow.
wasn't tortured himself, but he listened to he heard people being tortured in that prison. Um, and this is not like a regime that's a paragon of human rights. And the same is true to a much greater degree of the United States and Israel who are driving this conflict. So, this uh, uh, the idea that, for example, the US and Israel are going in to liberate women from, the harsh patriarchal Islamic Sharia law in Iran is just such a smokescreen. And it's the exact same lie that was used in Afghanistan, right? It's these exact same narratives of human rights were used in Iraq. And it's literally just cover. It is cover for what they want to do, which is expand their geopolitical power and wage these imperialist wars. So, yes, okay, we can acknowledge that the Iranian regime is not this paragon of human rights and democracy and feminist empowerment and so on. And that honestly has nothing to do with what's happening right now. Like the narrative that these strikes are somehow justified, that this illegal invasion, bilateral invasion of this country is somehow an improvement. Like, look at what happened in Afghanistan. Look at what happened in Iraq, where these narratives of human rights were were used cynically as propaganda tools to justify the exact same type of illegal war.
Yeah,
I
that
see.
old saying that, the one lesson we fail to learn from history, or that we do learn from history, is that we never learn from the lessons of history.
Yeah, yeah,
Because every single, foreign war that the United States has been in, probably since World War II, we could safely say, has been of course, there's a justification made for it, um, but it's always, the real reason isn't the benevolent reasons that are stated, of course. I
yeah,
think anyone that's has any kind of independent thinking knows that. And unfortunately, I know people who, you know, buy into these kinds of, I grew up with people
yeah,
that see the world in those kinds of narrative forms. In fact, I think that was the way I grew up thinking, but thankfully, like, applying some critical thinking along the way, yeah, because I think in 2004, 2000 to 2004, in that area, I was probably, "Oh, yeah, Iraq, they're pretty bad. They've been bad for a long time. We had to," they invaded Kuwait, and, so clearly they're, I just until you dig deep into it
yeah,
enough to know, or you see a pattern of behavior that the
yeah.
United States government is involved in, you see the fact that they don't intercede in conflicts around the world where there isn't oil. That's the number one thing. It just happens to be that the places that have oil are the most evil terrorists of all. Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, and I see more folks joining, welcome Robin, Fran, Terry, Bill Reese, glad to have you here. Catherine, thanks for joining. Um, if folks have questions or comments or thoughts, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try and address what people are saying there. But again, we're talking about Iran, and we're here. Both Justin and I write primarily not just from an anti-imperialist perspective, but often from an ecological biocentric perspective about defending the land. So we're kind of going to be trying to bring that lens to the discussion of the war in Iran here this morning. Um, some of course, this is a major oil producing region. I think Iran is the fifth largest oil producer in the world, and something like 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is now blocked. The Iranians have been striking oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in other countries around the region, and that's likely to continue. That's likely to escalate. Uh, the There's so much to say about this. We could go in a lot of different directions here, Justin. Again, we started by talking about the justifications for this war, which are just blatant falsehoods. This is an imperialist, aggressive war, and there is no justification for it. Um, Regardless of how bad the Trump administration and Netanyahu have wanted to take down Iran for many years, they didn't even bother to manufacture the type of consent that they attempted to do before Iraq and Afghanistan, let alone Vietnam, right? Where they conducted a whole full false flag operation, like a sophisticated lie that then used to manufacture the premise for a war. And I want to one of the things I want to share here real quick is the New York Times front page this morning, because I, I've done a lot of writing about the mainstream media outlets like the New York Times, not just the New York Times, but many others. Of course, Fox News and the right wing press are beating the drums for war, but the New York Times and the center right press, CNN, uh, MSNBC, now MS Now, all of these outlets are very similarly playing along with the administration. They are telling the narrative that it essentially advances the war's aim, the administration's aims. And look at this. This is the top of the New York Times this morning. I could not believe it. There's there You can't even see any story about the fact that the United States is engaged in an aggressive war. That investigators have just determined that the strike on the school in southern Iran that killed something like 175 schooled girls and teachers uh, is now not only it's confirmed that the United States conducted that strike, but it was AI targeting most likely that led to that strike hitting the school. Nothing on that on the front page of the New York Times. You got to scroll down. Sure, this is stuff
Buried.
related to the war. Scroll down, and here we go, right there. Tiny little story. Analysis suggests school was hit amid U.S. strikes on Iranian naval base. I mean, it's people have been criticizing the New York Times for a long time, right? And how, for example, when they talk about the US government, they always call it a government. And when they talk about Iran and other states, they always call it a regime, despite the fact that we live in an oligarchy. We don't live in a democratic society. We live in inverted totalitarianism. And this is well known, but the New York Times is a corporation. They're a multi-billion-dollar business. And their business model is basically aligned with the goals of the empire. Sure, they're more aligned with the Democratic ruling class than the Republicans, but when it comes down to war, they're going to fall in line like these fuckers always do, right? Just like they did with Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, 10 years later, we're so sorry that we bought into these narratives of war, and the New York Times coverage contributed to the US getting into this unjust war that can't be justified. And we regret our past mistakes. And here they are doing the exact same thing over and over again. They're not reporting on what's actually happening. They're telling this front page story about the jobs being down in the U.S. Sure, it's an important story to cover the economy, but it is so unimportant in the political sense compared to what's happening in Iran and in the Middle East right now. Sorry, Justin, I gotta let you get some words in because I can just rant all day here.
When Chuck Schumer and Donald Trump, when they get together and agree on something, you really have to know that the empire is behind it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Someone mentioned in the comments that there's this religious Christian ideology involved with this as well. And I think that's interesting. I've seen some stories where military commanders are saying that this is, Armageddon, which is, I don't know how familiar you are with the scriptures much, Max, but I grew up with it, and I remember hearing about this Armageddon thing, which is a place in the Middle East. It's actually a location. I don't know if it's actually in Israel or Greater Israel, but it's in the Levant, and it's a place where it's predicted that it's prophesied in the Bible that there will be the final battle will happen there, and it's between Gog and Magog, um, and Israel. And I think the implication that a lot of modern thinkers have brought into this is that the Arabs or the Muslims or something like that are this Gog and Magog, and so people have been talking about that for a long time. But the fact that you have military commanders saying this, you've had, I think there was like 200 complaints um, that were lodged against these commanders with some kind of agency, or I don't know, some kind of oversight committee in the military that oversees like religious discrimination. The fact that they're saying that, and that I think that's probably more widespread among the evangelical folks. Although it's interesting to see some rift in that area as well, because there's some conservatives like Tucker Carlson and uh, you know Dave Smith, who's a libertarian, who's a Trump supporter, who are not religious. Well, he's not religious. Tucker Carlson is, but these folks, they don't care about that stuff at all, and they're against this war for a lot of different reasons. And they're tired of all these endless wars. There's finally some people on the right that are seeing that, but a lot of I've noticed that a lot of evangelicals, even if they're MAGA, America First types, still it's like they just this is like a thing for them where they see this as some kind of spiritual war between Islam and Christianity,
Yeah.
and that's a
Yeah,
really scary
absolutely.
element.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's it's terrifying to read that story, to know that Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, probably a more accurate name for what they actually do, definitely a more accurate name, but to know that Hegseth is this evangelical. I mean, he's insane. He's literally insane, and he's the second most powerful. He's the second in command of all the U.S. military forces, or maybe he's third after the vice president. I don't know, but he's one of the most powerful people in the U.S. in the world, really, and he's directing the U.S. war machine. Um, a- and these people, many of these people actually believe that bringing about a catastrophic World War III style conflict focused in the Middle East is a good thing. It's what they want.
It'll
They
bring
see it
Jesus back.
right. They see it as bringing about the rapture, bringing Jesus back to earth, and bringing about the lifting of all the good Christians into heaven and casting all of the evildoers down into hell. Um, so we want if we want to talk about religious extremism, then we need to look at the United States as the center of religious extremism in the world today. It is the center of religious extremism in the world today. This is where, not just today, not just right now, but for many decades, for a long, long time, the most dangerous religious extremism in the world has emanated from the United States. And it's important that we recognize this because many people will point to Islamic extremism, which is reality. There's a lot of nastiness that comes out of that. There's a lot of, patriarchal ideologies, very destructive things that have come out of that. But we need to understand the history of this as well. So, for example, you look at the rise of ISIS. The rise of ISIS was fueled directly by the US invasion of Iraq and the fact that the US decapitated Iraq, took out Saddam Hussein, took out the Ba'athist powers, then, of course, went and took out the Ba'athists in Syria, taking down Bashar al-Assad. And the Baathists, for all their flaws, for all the things that were wrong with them, they represented this more secular, moderate force in that region. And all of a sudden, you have 500,000 Iraqi soldiers, many of whom are deeply religious, who are cut off, who are heavily armed, who have no chain of command. They have no societal framework around them to keep them aligned in the right direction. And uh, now you can see the reality of these things coming full circle because the US doesn't want to do a ground invasion, apparently, of Iran, although I believe there are 100% there are special forces going in and out of Iran right now, um, on the ground, doing various attacks and so on. 100% they're doing it.
I
And,
believe.
we need to recognize that since the Obama administration and before, but it really ramped up under the Obama administration, these clandestine special forces operations have been happening all around the world with essentially zero press coverage and public knowledge, let alone like congressional oversight. um, so 100% that's happening. But in lieu of a major ground invasion, at least for now, the US strategy is to arm and fund and provide air cover for essentially rebel groups, insurgent groups in and outside Iran to attack the regime. This is the strategy. This is what they did in Libya. This is what they did in Syria. This is what they did elsewhere. Um, and so gonna they're already providing funding and weapons to these groups. And one set of the groups is these radical Sunni groups in Iraq who are essentially ISIS. And they are attempting to weaponize these groups against the Iranian regime. So this is how the US empire, the CIA, the State Department, this is how they operate. They weaponize these groups to fight each other, to advance foreign policy and US geopolitical interests. And they don't give a shit about the ramifications of this, about the consequences. They don't care that they created ISIS, which then goes on to, behead people and, create sexual slavery and, terrorist attacks in the United States. This is how US foreign policy has been advanced and power has been built for decades and decades and decades. This isn't a new thing that we're seeing here. This is policy. This is policy. And just like in Libya, where taking out Gaddafi, the NATO airstrikes essentially were used to back up these local rebel insurgent groups who then killed Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who the U.S. had wanted to take out for a long time, because he hated the U.S. He represented an alternative axis of power, and he was trying to set up an Africa-wide alternative currency system, essentially, to the U.S. dollar. Um, uh, they took out Gaddafi, and what that led to is essentially the complete collapse of the Libyan state, immiseration, violence for millions and millions of people. There are literal slave markets that have emerged since Gaddafi was taken down in Libya, and the U.S. just washed their hands of it. Right? They just said, "Okay, we got him. We took out this alternative, axis of power that was causing problems for U.S. hegemony." And that's all we care about. They do not care about the human ramifications of this, let alone, of course, the ecological ramifications of it all.
Yeah, it seems comparable to like a mafia turf war, where the United States, the West are the most powerful family, if you will, and they're it's not to say that these other folks are good people, although there are a lot. There's a lot of propaganda about them being super evil. That's also sort of
Mhm.
overblown. Like Gaddafi, was kind of a socialist, and he was, he was for like you were saying, an alternative to
Mhm.
American hegemony. So you have
Yeah.
like an Arab nationalism, and Saddam, I think, was part of that too, right? And so just by doing that, it's like, no, the United States, we're actually the ones that get to collect protection money here, not you. Like, that's
Yeah.
what it really comes down to, is control. Um, and who's killed the most civilians? It's not It's not Iran. It's the United States has killed millions of people just in these countries, these 7 or so countries that we've named: Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, uh, and, so forth and so on.
Yeah. Let's
So
check out a headline on that. So this is research that was just published recently. This is about economic sanctions. This is not even about this is not even about the wars, the direct killing, right? This is sanctions. This is economic warfare. This is
these are not the
neocolonialism,
bombs.
right?
This is just the one.
We live in supposedly a post-colonial era, and yet the U.S. and its empire rules through neocolonialism, which is economic colonialism, and sanctions are one of the main weapons of this. So US and EU sanctions have killed 38 million people since 1970. And we're talking about people in Venezuela, people in Iran, people in Iraq, people in all these countries around the world that have been targeted by US sanctions and EU sanctions. And the people who are dying from those sanctions, it's not the elites. It's not the people who are in charge. It's not the government. It's everyday people. It's it's students. It's elderly people. It's children, infants. It's people with disabilities. It's the most vulnerable members of society. And yet they use these sanctions. I got this book right here, "Trade is War," written by Yash Tandon, who was a negotiator working in the World Trade Organization. And so he saw firsthand how these trade policies and sanctions and so-called free trade are used as blunt weapons of war in the modern world. And I think this is something that uh, is so overlooked. Again, we're looking at the New York Times coverage of these issues. Um, the New York Times is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They benefit from US economic hegemony over the world. They are among the primary beneficiaries, them and their shareholders and their board and those who are being enriched by them. And, this is why in my writing, I have tried to draw these connections between imperialism, neocolonialism, and the ecological crisis, because they cannot be separated. If we want to talk about capitalism and we want to talk about the profit motive, resource consumption, economic growth, which is happening and is pursued heavily in socialist countries as well.
Right.
This sort of productivism, so I don't make too much of a distinction between those to some extent, although I think there can be a distinction made. Um, Capitalism's the dominant force globally, of course, economically. But these tendencies, these motivating forces are completely aligned. And, this is the major driver of not only the ecological crisis, but the crisis of imperialism, the crisis of human rights that we're facing in the world today. And of course, this is layered on the sort of more fundamental ecological issues. I know Bill Reese was watching at least earlier. And so much of his work has been about overshoot, ecological overshoot, and the reality that modern human society has been built on simply taking more than the land can provide over and over and over again, and drawing down these finite and non-renewable stocks of resources, and drawing down even the renewable resources faster than they can be replenished in order to fuel a booming economy, growth in human society, expansion, and so on. These things are all part of the same civilizational processes that are playing out. And, it, it's the poorest people in the world, it's the civilians, it's the natural world, it's the climate, it's the species who are being driven extinct in the sixth mass extinction event of life on Earth, which is happening right now. And as Paul just posted, 90% of wars 90% of the victims of modern wars are civilians. 90% of those killed are civilians. Um,
It's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
this is, I mean, this is why the stock market is going up, right? This is how the economic dominance of the dominant economic powers in the world today is achieved. Is by exploiting people and exploiting the natural world brutally. Um, Maybe I'll just say go back for folks who are just joining us. We're talking about Iran. We're talking about the invasion of Iran, the attack on Iran led by Israel and the United States, the disaster that is, and our reflections on it, from an anti-imperialist perspective and also from an ecological perspective. And I'm Max Wilbert, Biocentric. This is Justin McAfee of Collapse Curriculum. So thank you all for being with us. So Justin, what's your take? I'm sure you've been reading as I have, sort of more on the military side of what's happening in the region. What's your take on what we're seeing over there?
The military side, you mean like who's winning and stuff like that, or?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just thinking. Again, I showed the New York Times front page, right? We're getting essentially no news from Western media, from mainstream media about the reality of what's happening in this
Mhm.
war. And if you go again, this is the New York Times, it would have you believe that there's not even a war happening. Israel pummels Beirut. There's nothing about the United States here except this little tiny thing. U.S. strikes on an Iranian naval base. U.S. submarine that sank an Iranian warship. By the way, that was likely a war crime. Apparently, it was an unarmed ship. I don't know the details, so I don't know if that's true. Apparently, it was an unarmed ship that was returning from a peacetime exercise in India, and apparently, the, some sort of naval treaties, or maybe it's Geneva Convention, state that if you sink a ship, you should attempt to rescue all the sailors who are left in the water or hanging onto the hulk of the ship afterwards. The U.S. didn't do that, so the Sri Lankans had to come in and do that. Um, but yeah, I'm just wondering because my feeling is that we are being lied to about the military reality of what's happening in the Middle East. We are being lied to. Is blatant military censorship in Israel. So there's literally a law that you cannot publish information that the military doesn't want you to publish. Israel is not a free society. It's essentially a military oligarchy, a military theocracy oligarchy. Um, and so we're not really seeing the reality of what's happening in Israel. We're not really seeing the reality of what's happening in the other countries in the Gulf because, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, these are monarchies. These are totalitarian societies. And they're treated in very friendly ways by the United States for purely financial reasons and reasons of empire. But these are not free and open societies.
Mm.
And so none of the US allies in the region have open media that are allowing what's actually happening to be reported. And as far as I know, there are basically no independent journalists, uh, very few reporting on what's happening from on the ground embedded positions. And the US military, of course, is they say that what, 6 US soldiers have been killed? I believe that is an absolute lie. I believe there's no way that only 6 US soldiers have been killed. I could be wrong, but from my reading of the situation, um, Iran has been pounding US bases in the region. I mean, a lot of Iran's drones and missiles have been getting shot down. But, like, there's a reason why no US president before Trump got into this war despite wanting to, because they knew it would be a military disaster, in addition to being an economic disaster, uh, with the Strait of Hormuz being closed off and so on. They knew it would be a military disaster because Iran is not a weak country militarily, and they are completely outclassed by the United States, but they're doing what everyone who's faced by that type of situation does. They're going to asymmetric warfare, guerrilla warfare tactics, and they're trying to bleed the United States and Israel dry. And from what I'm hearing, I don't know that all of this is true, but from what I've been hearing, seeing, and reading, Iran has been hammering U.S. assets throughout the region. They've been overwhelming the interceptor stockpile, which
Right.
is rapidly dwindling.
That's
Mainstream sources have been reporting on this increasingly. People who knew what was going on were reporting on it from day one and before the war broke out, and even back, last year. Um, the reality that Iran is using these $20,000 drones, and Israel and the US and Bahrain and the UAE and so on are shooting them down with $4 million missiles. Um, that
and there's only
are
so many of those missiles.
right, and they're incredibly complex and take a long time to manufacture. So this is Iran's strategy, and from what I'm hearing, they've not only been hitting U.S. bases throughout the region, they've been hitting the oil infrastructure. Iran has apparently destroyed 5 or 6 of the U.S.'s most advanced radar systems in the world, which each cost $500 million to $1 billion. The U.S. has 13 of these around the world, and Iran has apparently destroyed 6 of them, and has 2 left in the region. Um, 3 F-15 fighter jets shot down over Kuwait. They say it was friendly fire from Kuwait. I don't think I actually believe that. It could be, but this is amid a period where the U.S. was already saying they'd achieved aerial supremacy, and yet they said in a statement about this friendly fire that there were Iranian assets or drones or planes or something in the sky. When this happened, there were reports that another fighter jet was shot down over southern Iran, possibly a fifth one in Iraq. Which, I mean, even if it's just the 3 jets that have been confirmed, that's the biggest aerial losses that the US Air Force has suffered since, what, World War II, maybe? Certainly in decades. Um, at least half a dozen advanced drones have been shot down over Iran, possibly dozens. There are unconfirmed reports that the Iranians struck 2 US destroyers with ballistic missiles and set them on fire, or drones, I'm not sure which. One in the Indian Ocean, one near the Gulf of Hormuz. There are reports that the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier was driven off 1,000 miles by Iranian strikes that probably didn't hit it, but forced it to retreat. Um, uh, and there is the larger spreading reality of this conflict where it's not been very well reported again in Western news, but US embassies in Pakistan were stormed by angry people who essentially attacked the embassy. U.S. Marines opened fire on these protesters, killing multiple people. Um, the embassy in Bahrain has been attacked as well. Bahrain used to be part of Iran, um, and uh, a cultural affinity for Iran. So, and yes, as somebody just said in the comments, there have been uh, advertisements that somebody tracked down for a military contractor seeking to hire more employees to deal with dead soldiers' effects at Dover Air Base on the East Coast, which is where dead soldiers are sent home from overseas. So I believe that there's no way that casualties among U.S. military personnel are as low as we're being told. I think they're absolutely lying to us. These people are pathological liars. They don't give a
No, it's
shit about
the greatest war that's ever happened. What are you
yeah,
talking
they don't give a
Fake
shit about
news, man.
the truth. Um, they're lying to us. They're deceiving us, and um, I think that Iran's strategy is likely playing out exactly as they anticipated. Um, and the reality is, of course, the Iranian government is in a terrible situation. It's not like they're winning or things are going great, right? They're getting pounded. Um, but at the
And
same time, Iran probably isn't able to win the war in the short term. Their goal is to draw the war out. And so there are reports that Trump went to the Iranians maybe 3 times asking for a ceasefire since the war began, saying, "We'll stop bombing you." And the Iranians said no, because twice before they had a ceasefire, they were engaged in diplomacy, and the US attacked them, conducted a surprise attack against them. So the US has just completely destroyed any credibility they have for diplomacy. Um, and the US benefits if this is a short war, if things happen quickly. The Iranians benefit if it's a long war, if it's drawn out, if the economic, military, political costs of the war continue to go up and up and up for the United States and Israel. Um, and so they're using asymmetric tactics, hit and run. It's hide and seek. It's guerrilla warfare. Um, and,
what's the objective too? There was no stated objective, so how do you claim victory if you're Donald Trump? I almost wonder if like, what was he thinking just from his shallow perspective about the state of things? I mean, either he's, kind of naive, which I doubt, and he thought, "Oh, yeah, we'll just, knock out their nuclear, testing facilities," which they tried to do over the summer, and then we'll intimidate them, and then they'll give up. Did you really believe that that was gonna be the case? Because, just to put a couple things on the floor here, Iran is not Iraq. It's a completely different, geography and population and scale of military. Um, Iraq is, like, flat, and the United States military over the last half century was designed to fight in a theater of war against the Soviet Union. That was the primary enemy during the Cold War, right? And so most of that thinking, this is why we didn't, I think, do well in Asia, is because that's wasn't what our military was primarily designed to do. It was designed to fight tanks in the open plains of Russia. And so Iraq was kind of like a similar environment, and we had been preparing to do that for a long time. But Iraq is, it's mountainous, and there's 90
Iran.
million people there. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Iran.
Yeah.
Iran is mountainous,
Yeah.
and so it's not gonna be the same. Yeah, sure, we have, from what I understand, I've heard at least that there's enough air superiority right now where they're flying, subsonic bombers like the B-52 over Iranian airspace without much flak, pun intended, um, because they've knocked out their radars. And so you can't get air support, um, up in the air to fight to knock down B-52s with your fighter jets, if you don't have radar. But even if that's the case, One of the problems is, like Iran has mobile missile sites, and so they can move them around, they can hide them, stuff like that. And as long as they're able to keep shooting missiles at Israel and other targets in the Middle East,
Mhm.
military bases and such, eventually, like you said, within a week or two, those supplies of defense missiles are going to run out. They're just simply going to
Right.
run out. And that's the question: is can they maintain that level of bombing to run those things out, and then they can start really doing damage in the
Yeah.
region.
Yeah.
It may not happen, it may happen, but, regardless of whether that occurs or not, you're absolutely right that a long the worst thing that could happen for the United States is a long war, but it almost seems like it's inevitable, and that was the problem with this whole thing in the first place, just from a I mean, we're talking in sort of in terms of the military thinking and where this goes, where it's likely to what's likely to happen, and what's likely to happen at this point, I think you're right, unless Trump's good at pivoting, so he could be like, "Well, we won. We're gonna go home now. We're not fighting anymore." I don't know. Maybe that would work, but I don't know. Does Iran stop shooting? Does I don't think so. So they're gonna have to stay, and then that they get dragged in, and then they're gonna have to start sending in more and more ground troops. And
Right.
to what extent can they keep lying about? Usually the truth comes out when it comes to soldiers dying because the families and people notice when their family members go missing. You know what I mean? So that truth eventually comes out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think frankly the Trump regime is scrambling right now. I think that they basically got way in over their head. I mean, look at the huge firings and purges that took place in the Department of Defense um, last year um, under Hegseth, under Trump. They were essentially getting rid of anyone who was going to say no to them. They were getting rid of the voices of reason, and I say that that's a relative term. Obviously,
Sure.
you're talking about generals. You're talking about
Right.
high ranked officials in the Department of Defense. Um, but the reality is, there were a lot of people who were saying, "This is a terrible idea. Don't do this." Um, there is no winner. The United States will not win this war if they invade Iran. And I think those people just got fired. They just got purged. And so now they've got a bunch of yes men in the Department of Defense who are these Christian nationalists, fascists, theocratic, eh, insane people who are chomping at the bit for war. And now I think they're in over their heads. But, um, you know, I think the Trump administration is gonna, they put themselves in a very difficult situation because they they can't back out without if they back out, it will probably be considered an Iranian victory. And, um, and Iran will have established deterrence pretty significantly. They might do that because the alternative is stay in a long war and, uh, potentially send in ground troops and get involved in a long, lengthy, uh, boots on the ground conflict. And look at what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Alfred McCoy wrote this book, the what is it called? Sunset on the American Century or the Twilight of the American Century. And it's all about how the invasion of Afghanistan was the beginning of the end for American empire. It was just like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the beginning of the end for the USSR. Um, it was just this massive bleed of resources, of political integrity, of goodwill around the world that destroyed, contributed to the destruction of the USSR economically, politically, and beyond. And Alfred McCoy, who's a prominent historian and political scientist, looks at the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan as the beginning of the end for US empire and predicts that by the 2030s, China will be the preeminent force geopolitically in the world and the US will be, fading like the British Empire did as its empire began to collapse. And we're seeing that play out right now. I mean, this invasion of Iran to me is an accelerant of the collapse of US society that was already underway. Um,
You know,
and we're
when you're done, let me get there's something that might interest you about all of that, actually.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, as we're talking, more news coming in. Kuwait cutting oil production as storage fills up. Um, I believe was it Qatar that completely cut off their natural gas production, and gas prices in Europe spiked 50% immediately. Another ship was hit in the Strait of Hormuz 5 hours ago, the 13th ship hit by Iran since the war began. Um, Missile launches from Iran targeting Tel Aviv. Um, uh, this Iran prepared for this to be a long war, and I believe that they're undertaking a very deliberate strategy to make it a long war. Some of the videos that have come out of missile launches from Iran have shown not just mobile launchers from trucks, but ballistic missiles actually being launched from underground, from these buried uh, silos with just what appears to just be a thin layer of dirt over the top, making them essentially completely undetectable to satellites and other things. And again, Iran has been preparing for this war for decades, and they knew that this was the strategy that Israel and the United States were going to take, almost certainly, because again, this is what they did in Libya. This is what they did in Syria. You have to go back to Iraq for the U.S. to do boots on the ground, and the lesson that they learned from that was don't do boots on the ground, just do special operations and empower the local fighters and so on. So I really think that this is becoming increasingly a military disaster for the United States, and in addition to the political and ecological disaster that it represents.
Well, that's certainly true. One thing I heard it was actually Tucker Carlson that talked about this, which is interesting. He did a segment where he talked about the republic is over. The republic is over. It's not a republic anymore. It's basically becoming an autocracy. I think we've known that for a long time. But when coming from him, it's interesting because he mentioned the fact that they were increasing the military budget by up to $1.5 trillion from 900 billion. So that's a over a 50% increase
Right.
in the military budget. And basically, the only time that's ever happened um, is before something major, like they're preparing for a world war. It
Mhm.
sounds like so. If we're reading the subtext, it really, we have enormous debt to the Chinese. I've heard for example, Venezuela was connected to the Chinese in the sense that they were trying to get access to Venezuelan oil. And that was the primary motivation. Iran is obviously friendly to the Chinese. Even heard militarily speaking that they may test supersonic anti-ship missiles that the Chinese have developed. They may that may wind up in Iran. Um, Potentially even nuclear weapons might wind up in Iran. How about that? But either way, the sort of subtext is that there's a shift, there's a realignment of geopolitical power. The old world order is dying, and so now it's like basically that's already essentially happened, and now everyone's vying to be in the next phase of it. So the United States under Trump is trying to shore up using the Monroe Doctrine, the Western Hemisphere plus you know, um, Europe and whatever other assets they can get before it's divided up between the Russians, the Chinese, and the West. And so if you look at it through that lens, maybe they went into this saying it wasn't going to be a long war. There's the midterm elections coming up and all that kind of thing. But and I don't. This is obviously speculation here, but one possibility in my mind is that if if this is what the buzz is on the conservative side among people who have access to the White House, that the republic is over, that potentially elections could go away. That might be the long game. So, okay, they know this isn't going to be popular. I think when we went into Iran this time in February, even like over 50% of Republicans were against it. and like 80% of the country was against it. So it was not popular to begin with, and it's just going to become increasingly unpopular. But it seems like that's exactly what they're doing.
Yep.
So the only way that makes sense to me, at least, yeah, is there's not an election.
Yeah, yeah, and, of course, I've been heavily critical of the Democrats for a long, long time, I mean, they have played this exact same imperial role
Sure,
in expanding US empire, waging foreign wars, massacring civilians, engaging in the most brutal forms of aggressive empire imperialist control. Um, and at the same time, these are different factions, right? The ruling class is fractured; it's not unitary, and so I think the Trump administration does want to preserve power at all costs. And some speculation that I've heard is that the Trump administration is going to use the reality of this war. There could be actual terrorist attacks in the United States, or there could be false flag attacks, or there could be cyber attacks, quote unquote, on US election sites and attempts to interfere. The Iranians are attacking our election, right? So we need to shut down the election. We need to move to purely in person voting. We need to, so on and so forth. Maybe this will only take place in certain swing states, swing districts, certain areas that are deemed important by those in power. But it's certainly not out of the question. I mean, the Trump administration and Trump himself have been openly talking about a third term, about stopping elections. They're saying the words themselves. It's not hyperbole to say that they fucking mean it, because
right.
they mean what they say. Like, this guy has been he says exactly what he means, right? And so yes, this is a reality. And again, I don't believe that we live in a functional democracy. We live in an oligarchy, and the research shows this. There is empirical research that shows that the relationship between public sentiment and policy outcomes is essentially nil. So it doesn't matter if 75% of the people think this war is a bad idea. They're still going to fucking do it because they want to, and they're in power. We're not. Whereas the ruling class, business interests, and the wealthy, you look at the relationship between their sentiment towards a given policy and whether or not it happens, and it's essentially a one-to-one correlation. The graph looks like this. If they don't want it, it doesn't happen. If they do want it, it happens. And for us, for everyday people, the graph is flat. It does not matter what we think or how we vote. And so, with that said, I'm an advocate of the defensive use of the vote. We live in a country where people died in order to expand the franchise, to bring the vote to women, to people of color, to others. And I think they are engaging in gerrymandering, in attempts to rig elections, attempts to undermine elections, because they know that it is a tool that people can use to undermine their power and their aims in some ways, in limited ways. And so I don't see electoral politics as leading us ultimately to the promised land. But
Yeah.
I think it is a realm of defensive struggle in which we can carve out space for more revolutionary transformations of society to occur that probably won't happen through the ballot box and through electoral politics. But if Trump remains in power, if he gets a third regime or cancels elections, then no fucking way the revolution is going to happen in this way. And all we need to do is look at um, popular movements and when they've emerged and how they've flourished over the past couple decades to see this. Whether we're talking about the Occupy movement, Standing Rock, Black Lives Matter, these mass protest movements, the Palestine encampments. These mass protest movements have been able to gain more traction and flourish more and change society than under more progressive, more democratic administrations than they have under the Republicans, to some extent. Um, and there's a reason why the Democratic Party sabotage Bernie Sanders. I personally think Sanders' politics are pretty tepid compared to my own, but he is a far preferable alternative to Clinton and certainly to Trump, right? But the DNC, of course, just undermined and completely destroyed his campaign and his ability to move forward because, again, the ruling class closes ranks when they see themselves threatened. They close ranks in times of war. They close ranks against people's movements, revolutionary movements, transformative movements, even if they're relatively tepid like Sanders was. But again, the reality is the policies that Sanders was talking about, universal health care, taxing the rich, uh, these types of things are exceptionally popular across the political spectrum. But that's not going to result in them actually happening until we have some more fundamental change in these systems.
Now,
Um,
let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. Are you familiar with Jacques Ellul? Uh,
I know the name, but I haven't read his work.
so he wrote The Technological Society.
Yeah.
It's a book, and he basically says that this is similar to other stuff I think you are familiar with, that technology becomes, like, one of his premises essentially is that technology becomes autonomous, that society basically restructures itself to serve technology.
Mhm.
Um, and so, and I don't know, like, how philosophical you want to get on this, but essentially that connecting this to technology, all of this is that society at large, not us as individuals, but society at large, the way it, because we rely on technology so much, the more and more we rely on it, the more and more society by default is serving technology. Like, for example, fossil fuels, which
Yeah.
is the central theme, I would say, of what's happening in Iran,
Yeah.
regardless of all the other bull crap that they want to say. Uh, but pretty much all resources, trade, and all of those things all basically serve technology. That is the purpose.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, the purpose of society and technology isn't to serve the greater good or humanity, it is to serve itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we can see this playing out through the war economy, in many ways. I mean, the oil company stocks are skyrocketing right now, and so are the defense contractors. Um, and this is the reality of capitalism: is that no matter what happens, it's going to be monetized. It's going to be profitable to those in power, whether there's a recession or not. The rich people are going to win. They're going to come out on top, and there is. Um, there is a real sense in which the elites like Trump and his cabinet and people in his orbit, they are Chris Hedges has written about this pretty extensively. They are sort of overseeing the dismantling of the US society in order to further enrich themselves. It's sort of become a gangster state, right? It's become like um, the Soviet Union in the wake of Russia in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, where you have these billionaire oligarchs who are essentially controlling mafia domains of the economy and wringing every last scrap of profit out of them while using violence and authoritarianism to control the situation there in every way they can. Um, so it's I think we already live in that situation. Look at our reliance on oil. I mean, right now the price of oil I think is at $93 a barrel, up from 60 before this conflict began. So 50% spike in I don't know what uh, couple weeks here in advance of the attack on Iran and the actual attack, and it's skyrocketing. I mean, here's the screen. Here's the front page on oilprice.com. Sky's the limit for current oil price rally. And they say price rally because many people who read this site and probably the authors they're investing they're investors in oil. So when price goes up, they're happy. That means profit for them. Um, but the reality is we've all become dependent upon these technological resources because we're in a state of overshoot. I mean, look at one prediction that I've seen from various military analysts is that as interceptors begin to be further depleted across the Middle East, Iran may begin to target water desalination plants because there are millions and millions, tens of millions of people who live in this area who are dependent upon desalinated seawater for drinking, for agriculture, for all basic uses. And those are powered by fossil fuels and they are extremely vulnerable. And so, the Iranian regime, they may begin to target these facilities. As far as I know, they haven't yet. And that may be a deliberate policy because it would certainly be in the Iranian regime's best interest to limit their targeting of civilian sites. There have been some cases where they've hit hotels, um, public places, but it was reported even by the Washington Post that Department of Defense personnel were staying in those hotels, that they'd evacuated from the military bases, were staying at these hotels, and they were posting on social media. They were not hiding where they were. They were being very open about the fact that they were there. There's also talk that potentially there were CIA and Mossad offices located in some of these high rises that were targeted by Iran. I don't know that, but I do know that in asymmetric conflict, it would behoove the Iranian government to limit their targeting of civilians so as to try and shift public opinion in Iran and elsewhere in their favor. And because right now, Israel and the United States are just carpet bombing Tehran. I mean, yes, they're hitting military sites and government sites. They're also just hitting apartment buildings. They're hitting hospitals. They're hitting schools. Another school was struck today, apparently. 12 hospitals have been bombed in Iran. Um, and, uh, this, for folks who are just joining us, we've been talking here for over an hour about the invasion of Iran, focusing on the blatant lies and justifications that are being told for this war. Oh, you said it, Justin. Oh, Iran is 2 weeks away from getting a nuclear weapon. They've been 2 weeks away for 30 years at this point. Um, we know that's a complete lie. The lead negotiator who was facilitating talks between Iran and the United States came to the U.S. to go on the news a few days before the war broke out and said, we have we have reached an agreement in regards to nuclear weapons and nuclear enrichment that goes further than anything previously. The Iranian regime had agreed to not only, from what I understand, they'd agreed to export all their enriched material to the United States, uh, so that and have inspectors come into Iran to look at their nuclear facilities so that any material that could be used for weapons could be removed and they would only have access to the non-weapons grade material that's used for nuclear power and nuclear medicine, X-rays,
Well,
and
they
all.
didn't have weapons grade. I mean, they had 60% enriched uranium,
Yeah,
which, by the way, is under the non-proliferation treaty. Like, there's no set amount that says you can't go over this amount, but usually you get to 90% enrichment, and that's weapons grade. There's no, like, the argument is there's no civilian use for 60% enriched uranium, but it was a very small amount anyways. And there was an agreement, right, with Iran, and then Trump just tore it up.
yep, yep, exactly.
So
Yeah, and the hypocrisy there is wild. Israel has 300 nuclear weapons at least.
that's
Uh, Completely illegal. They're not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They refuse to acknowledge that they have these weapons. They refuse to allow inspectors from the UN to check out their stockpile. Um, and they hold on to this. What do they call it? The Samson option, right? Israel has an acknowledged policy that if they're ever facing military defeat, they will launch nuclear weapons against essentially the entire Muslim world. And this is known policy in Israel. Um, it's eh, eh, this is why countries develop nuclear weapons. This is why North
Correct.
Korea, for example, has developed nuclear weapons because they knew that if they didn't have them, then they were going to be next to get invaded. So,
'Cause you don't invade countries with nuclear weapons, generally speaking.
right, and I I I can't help but say this, Justin. I wish this war had never happened. I wish that the US had been smart enough to not invade Iran, to not launch this attack because it is unleashing devastation. And my sympathies are with the civilians, they're with the people who are being killed, they're with the land that's being poisoned, the sea that is being poisoned by oil spills, is with the climate, the billions of people who are going to be impacted by the US military as the largest polluter in the world. Um, I wish this war had never happened, but now that it has happened, now that Israel and the United States have invaded, I hope that Iran wins. I do. I hope that Iran wins. Just like when the US went into Iraq, my sympathies lay with the insurgents fighting against the US military occupation. Because yes, you can say all you want about the Iranian government and their repressiveness and their religious theocracy and so on. But they have a right to self-defense. People have a right to self-defense, and the outcome based on history will be worse for the Iranian people and the entire world if the US and Israel succeed. That's just what the history shows. So I, I honestly from a perspective that that would be a better outcome than if the US and Israel achieved their goals. Um, they the US and Israel don't have human rights in mind. They don't have ecology in mind. They have dominance in mind. That's what they want. They want
Yes.
to destroy they went into Venezuela and took out Venezuela because that was one of a few countries in the world that were selling oil outside the US dollar, sending oil to China, sending oil to Cuba, and enabling, this sort of thorn in the side of US hegemony, economic and military hegemony of the world. That's why they took out Venezuela. That's why they're going against Iran, uh, because they want to destroy the society. And they do not care what happens to the people there. The lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan, 1,000,000 people dead, right? 1,000,000 people dead. And as you have, the Democrats in Washington, D.C., so many of them sort of cosplaying resistance to this through this war powers resolution saying, the problem is not this invasion. The problem is Congress didn't actually authorize it. And then so many of those same Democrats turning around and saying, I'll vote for the $50 billion extra funding for the Pentagon for this war. It's a travesty to me. And I don't
That's where
want
they
to
have the
see
real power is the purse.
yeah, and I don't wanna see US soldiers killed, I've
Sure.
known a lot of people who are veterans who've been in the military. I don't wanna see civilians hurt. I don't wanna see Iranians killed. I don't wanna see anyone killed, but I do think if we're looking at it, soberly from the perspective of anti-imperialism, human rights, and ecology, I think it would be better for the planet if the Iranians fought off the US empire. Um, in this situation. And do I hope that the Iranian people, rise up in some way and, create some sort of egalitarian ecological society in the future? Absolutely. But the reality that they're dealing with right now is bombs raining down from Western powers. And, our work here in the United States is to overthrow this imperialist, destructive government, this oligarchy that we live under. And I think it's not our job to go destroy other nations and lay waste to them in order to supposedly advance human rights when it just so happens it's really about geopolitical power. That is, it's not just a lie; it's one of the most dangerous lies in the world.
Yeah, and we have an example in the Middle East of, we need to get the copy of some of Murray Bookchin's books to Iran, and they can talk to the Kurds there, because that's really been a successful story, in my opinion, at least in Rojava, which is the area in Syria where the Kurds live. They've been able to, create and I don't know all of their policies and whatnot, but it is a bottom up system of democracy. They are, most Kurds by far are Muslim, but it's, a feminist, ecological, bottom up democratic system.
Mhm.
Um, it's not exactly what you would say anarchist, because it's organized, but it doesn't have the hierarchy. You start with the neighborhood, then you go to the town level, to the regional level, and then like I think there's 4 cantons there, and so you start at the bottom. People vote on stuff,
Yeah.
and the principles. Some of them are that you have anytime you have a committee and there's like a chair, you have to have a male and a female chair.
Mhm.
Anytime you have a military leader, same thing. So, and they have all female militia units for their defense. And you just look at the possibility of that, even in a Muslim society, the kind of freedom and liberty and self determination that could really exist in a place like that,
Yeah.
if they, were able to sort of, you know, come to an agreement about those kinds of ideas. And probably right now, it's probably not even allowed to be discussed
Mhm.
in the open, and that's we can acknowledge that two things can be true at the same time. We can acknowledge that nation states are oppressive and patriarchal, probably, in all kinds of other ways.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the United States out nation stating another nation state is the right thing to do because one of them doesn't allow free speech. I don't think that's definitely not the motivation either way.
Yeah, and I just want people who are sucked into that narrative to recognize that, when Marco Rubio and his State Department staff sit down to write their talking points for how are we gonna justify this war to the media, that's they write that down before they even sit down at the conference room table, right?
All right.
That's like the first thing they write down. Um, and again, this is Trump, who's a sexual predator in office, who's a rapist, who's been abusing women for decades, right? Who um, is normalizing this behavior throughout the United States. This is Hegseth, who believes that women shouldn't have the right to vote and should be forced back into the home and should do the bidding of their husbands. This is a religious theocracy that's in power here. And yes, we have some rights for women, thanks to the uh, the feminist movement, and thanks to generations of people fighting like hell and dying in many cases, going to prison, taking big risks, dedicating their lives and their work to fighting for those rights. We have that in this country, and we need to maintain that and expand it. Um, but it is just it is completely being used for cynical purposes, that type of argument, by the regime here in the United States. And a couple other points that I want to throw in here, Justin. We should probably wrap up somewhat soon, but the power of the Israeli lobby in the United
Mm.
States, AIPAC, Miriam Adelson, a billionaire, casino billionaire, one of the main funders of the Trump regime. She is an out and out Zionist fanatic, right? And Trump was in Israel with Miriam Adelson, joking about how she probably loves Israel more than the United States, and she wants me to take action on behalf of Israel. So I'll probably do it. Um, AIPAC is controlling huge amounts of the U.S. political structure, politicians on both sides of the aisle, and the money talks, right? Money talks. I mean, there is a organized campaign of political bribery that is legal and is being waged by AIPAC and its associated groups inside the United States to corrupt the entire United States government in favor of Israel and Israeli foreign policy. And uh,
And the media, did you see that they bought Larry Ellison bought CNN?
Yep, yep. It's only it a and this is only going to continue. I mean, this is not it's getting worse, and it's going to continue getting worse. We need to recognize this. We need to step away from these, mainstream news sources, the New York Times, CNN, NBC, Fox News, MS Now. Um, I'll check in on them
CBS.
occasionally to see what they're saying, but I
Sure.
do that deliberately to get a read on what the propaganda is, right?
Right.
Especially when it comes to foreign policy. Yeah, there's good journalism that is being done by people at these outlets. Uh, I've been interviewed by CNN. I've been interviewed by New York Times for different things, and they've done good journalism at times. But when it comes to foreign policy issues, they are functioning essentially as tools of the ruling class. And we'll see over time, they'll probably walk it back in coming years. They'll probably say, oh, we made mistakes and we should have done this or that. Um, People are asking what sources to follow for news. I've been reading pretty broadly, but I've been reading drop site news for one. I'll follow
Yeah, that's a good one.
Al Jazeera, even though I believe it's funded by, is it the Qatari government, which is a major U.S. ally in the region. So, I don't trust them 100%, but they're more impartial. It's worth checking in on some of the international news sources like Reuters and BBC. Again, even though those are mainstream institutional sources, to get more of a sense of what's being said across the political spectrum. And then I'm reading pro Iranian government sources because I know that they're putting out propaganda. I know that the US side is putting out propaganda. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So the Iranian government sources tend to give um, a more complete military picture than you might get from the US side. Again, I know probably half of what's on there is not true and is propaganda, um, but some of it is true. Um, and we know that that's been confirmed. Um, there's a lot of good writers who are covering the war on Substack. Um, who are you reading, Justin?
On foreign policy, I mean, I what I kind of do is, yeah, I read the headlines and stuff wherever the news is, like you do, just to see what everyone's saying. And I don't know, I watch like independent media too, like someone like the Young Turks or even like Piers Morgan and Tucker Carlson on YouTube because I mean, they're they don't work for anyone anymore. They used to. And like Tucker Carlson, I know like he was one of the most hated conservative talk show people in the world on Fox News, but like he really had I mean he still is like has tons of things that I would not agree with him on, but when it comes to like how he defines the forever wars and we were just talking about Israeli influence over American policy. Like he is up to date on that kind of thing, like really tack sharp on that kind of stuff. Even to the point of talking about like, Mus- did Mossad have anything to do with explosions in Saudi Arabia? What is Israel's greater objective in this war? He posited the theory that getting the United States out of the Middle East might be a long term goal of Israel, kind of like the British essentially were forced out of the Middle East because of the chaos that was ensuing because of their governance. Well, if Israel can create enough chaos in the Middle East, in other words, you don't actually care about Iran's regime change. You just create chaos there. You create chaos in all the Gulf states, and eventually that just makes you Israel the hegemon. And so and the United States kind of becomes too unpopular as it is, right? And the United States takes a step back, and then Israel just runs things. That's a lot of people think that that's maybe what their objective is. And I heard that listening to Tucker Carlson's analysis. Again, I don't know. Maybe he's wrong about that. He's wrong about a lot of things, but but he seems to, when it comes to like, he was really great on Gaza, and Piers Morgan too, another guy that he was against the first Iraq War. Not a lot of journalists were, and he has, he usually has guests on that are also independent media,
Mhm.
and they talk about, and again, some of it's bull, but he'll have Dave Smith, who's a libertarian, on, and he'll have some person from like um, Newsmax or one of the, what's that guy's name? Who's the who's the guy that's kind of taken the place of Charlie Kirk? He wears the yarmulke, kind of an
Mm.
intellectual on the right.
I don't pay any attention
Anyway,
to crazies.
yeah. So anyway, he'll have someone from that organization on, and they'll kind of all fight it out. But a lot of times in that process, you kind of get a sense for you know what are the different sides saying, and
Yeah.
you get different perspectives and insights. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth listening to the right-wing sources to see what they're saying at least and to understand what's happening. There is sort of this fracturing going on in the MAGA coalition around foreign policy right now,
Yeah,
and
someone mentioned
yeah, I mean,
breaking
Tucker
points.
sorry?
Someone mentioned breaking points as well.
Yeah, Breaking Points has been doing some good coverage. Yeah, I think Tucker Carlson's a deplorable person. I think his politics are pretty awful, but it's interesting to see this sort of anti-interventionist um, fraction of the right um, gaining prominence. And sites that I'm following for news, Drop Site News, which is on Substack,
That's great.
they're doing great coverage of what's going on. Treat to Parsi, who's a foreign policy expert from the region. Um, Larry C. Johnson has been doing some writing from more of a military analysis perspective, helping to break down why the mainstream narratives that Trump and the administration are putting out there about their military dominance are wrong, and why this war is kind of falling apart already. Jeremy Scahill, of course,
What do you think of
former
Caitlin Johnston?
Caitlin Johnston's always doing good work. It's she's sort of more on the polemic side, which is great and important. She's a great writer. Muan Rabbani, incredible, a scholar of especially Palestinian history and resistance, but also covering this issue in detail. Following the group Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, organizations like this have been hard at it. Medea Benjamin and them have been hard anti-war activists for a long time and are continuing that work. Democracy Now! Is worth checking out. It's in my view, it's kind of like mainstream liberal news for the most part, but they do some pretty good anti-war coverage, and they'll do a good daily breakdown of what's going on from a big picture. Um, Glenn Greenwald is definitely worth following on these
Chris
issues.
Hedges.
Antiwar.com, which is it's really run by libertarians, speaking of sort of right-wing anti-war movements, but definitely worth reading. Their executive director or head is a really sharp guy I think he was on Breaking Points recently. Um, there's a lot of good material out there. So yeah, what I would just urge people is don't go to the New York Times, don't go to CNN, don't go to NBC or MS Now or Fox News or any of these sites. Or if you do, just go there to see what the lies are. What's the tenor of the lies that are being told? Because so many of the stories that you see on these front pages are written by journalists who are sitting in an office in New York or somewhere else, and they are getting press releases or going to press conferences held by the government and then reporting on what they're told. That's essentially all they're doing. Um, I'm not aware of independent journalists on the ground in Iran from the United States or from elsewhere who are covering the situation. I know that a CNN journalist just went in yesterday with permission from the Iranian government and is reporting from inside Iran. Um, During the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, one of the best news sources was uh, Dar Jamail, who's a friend of mine now, who went in as an unembedded journalist and was We need the truth. We don't need this corporate bullshit that's coming out of the mainstream media. So we may see that at some point coming forward increasingly. Um, but yeah, Justin, my heart is heavy, man. My heart is heavy seeing this because, again, this is just an additional fuck you to to the climate, to the planet. I mean, the the oil spills, the carbon emissions, the ecological disaster that is warfare is continuing. It's expanding. This could expand to become a larger regional war. People are talking about World War III. There's the Ukraine Russia war. There, Afghanistan and Pakistan are at war now. There's the tensions over Taiwan. Azerbaijan is threatening to attack Iran now. Iran's attacking all the GCC nations. Israel and the US are pounding Iran. It's a very warlike time right now. And a lot of these nations have military alliances with each other. Turkey is part of NATO, and they've been
Oh, doesn't Israel want to attack Turkey now? Isn't
Israel
that a
wants to
thing?
attack Turkey because they're seeing them as the next threat after Iran.
Hey, how many
Turkey
wars are we going to
Turkey
get
will be
into?
potentially very upset if the U.S. starts backing the Kurds because Turkey has been fighting the Kurds for many years, including the
Right.
PKK and the folks in Rojava, seeing them as a separatist threat because of a long history of rebellion among those people. Um, so there's certainly a non-zero possibility that this could expand outwards and really become a global war of some sort. And that's a disaster for the planet. It's a disaster for innocent people, for everyday people, for families, for kids, for old people. It's a disaster for the soldiers who are being told to go kill, and most of them probably don't want to, unless they're rabid, rabid IDF ideologues who think that they're doing God's work by, murdering civilians in Tehran right now. Um, And, yeah, my heart's heavy for everyone who's affected by what's happening right now. In my view, the only perhaps small bright spot that comes out of this, and I don't know how bright it is, Jolene mentioned Ecuador. Of course, US Special Forces just got sent down there a couple days ago to engage in anti-drug operations. Um, But, maybe I don't know if it's a silver lining, but the destruction of oil infrastructure, the destruction of pipelines, the halting of international oil transportation from the planet's perspective, that's a good thing. From a climate perspective, that's a good thing. It's gonna hit us all really hard. Gas prices are already up. Um, uh,
Which means supply chains,
it's gonna
the
hit
cost.
the poor especially hard, but I've been advocating for many, many years that the environmental movement needs to start targeting oil and gas infrastructure and sabotaging it nonviolently if necessary and using force if necessary, because we're living in a catastrophic ecological situation and the future is going to be far, far, far worse if we don't stop these things. And governments, corporations have proven themselves incapable or unwilling to actually stop the burning of fossil fuels. That's a whole nother 2 hour live stream
Mm.
conversation there. That's not really the topic of this, but I do
We
have
shall
to say,
have that type of conversation.
as
We
much
sh
as my heart is hurting for the impacts on civilians, I can't say I'm not cheering to see oil facilities going up in flames and to see tankers halted and to see um, oil prices skyrocketing. I'm broke right now. I'm really poor. My partner may be about to lose her job in the school district because they're cutting funding locally. Like we're not doing well, and we're in a great situation compared to many people, right? We're very lucky and blessed, not just to be white and live in the United States just by chance. That's where we were born. But because of family and so on, we're doing pretty decently well. A lot of people are going to be really heavily negatively impacted by what's happening economically, and that's part of Iran's strategy: is put the pressure on the United States and the West through targeting the global economy. But with all that said, I've been saying for years, it's not about me and my comfort. And, with what's coming, with the climate apocalypse that's already here, the complete collapse of ecology around the planet. Yeah, it's gonna be really hard, but I think we need this oil infrastructure to be targeted. We need it to be taken out. And so, yeah, my heart is heavy. Maybe there's some good that will come out of this ultimately. Um, it's this is a disaster for human rights and for people in the region. It seems like, despite the message that we're being showed by the Western media, it's increasingly a military disaster for the United States and Israel and their allies in the region. Um, but I don't know. What do you got? What do you got, Justin? Anything else to help close us out?
You know, I did an interview with Nikki Hill, I think and
Yeah.
one thing that she said that stuck with me a little bit was that this place isn't a gentle place. This planet we live on, and never has been, and so
Mm,
it's a place of change, and it's often a place of swift and violent change, but
mm,
it's also a very resilient system. We are resilient as beings, and so as all of these things happen, that's just something that I like to keep in mind, that this is change, and change is inevitable. It's the rule, not the exception. So
mhm,
uh, expect to see things change as the empires that have been running on a Ponzi scheme of global capitalism, as that Ponzi scheme or house of cards begins to fall. Um, we just have to expect that that kind of change is going to happen, but that we are resilient, and we should have that mentality. I think having a good mentality as these events occur is good to have. But I hope we continue to chat. There's lots to talk about with obviously there's the global situation, and then there's immediate environmental concerns, and I really enjoy having a chat with you, Max. Thank you.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This is not going to be a quick one. Unlike the claims from the administration, they really thought they were going to do one strike and take down the Iranian regime. And from all the reports that I've heard, Khamenei, who was 86 years old and supposedly had cancer, he made a choice to stay in his house, basically, that was unfortified and just sitting there in Tehran, knowing that an airstrike was likely coming um, because martyrdom is essentially one of the central tenets um, uh, uh, of their religion, and they're Shia, and so it could be said that the Iranians really um, that Khamenei really baited the United States into killing him. Uh, I don't know if that's true, but apparently those are the reports that his advisors and people were telling him, go to the bunkers. You shouldn't be spending any time above ground. And he decided to do that. And you know, um, this isn't somebody who I personally admire. But again, I think I just look at this situation and I just say it is a disaster for the United States and the Israelis to have done this. I think it's going to backfire. I think this is the imperial boomerang in effect. And and if I'm wrong, and if the United States and Israel emerge victoriously, stronger than ever in the short term, um, I think that's probably the worst possible outcome for the planet and for our future, because that'll only embolden these Zionist fascists and Christian fascists who have uh, their hands are covered in oil and blood, and that's the language that they speak, is violence and power. And um, and if they walk away from this saying this worked, it went great, everything's fine, then they're just going to be empowered to do more and more of that around the world. Who's next? Cuba, um, and then the internal dissidents, and then the journalists, and then of course the immigrant. They've already been coming for the immigrants. It's there's no end.
Very true. Same shit, different day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I laugh only because, I mean, I don't know. You kind of have to smile and just, take it all in because, you know, it's serious, but at the same time, it's kind of ridiculous. And I laugh. I think that the absurdity and ridiculousness of it all is, you know, why do I laugh at that? I don't know. You tell me, Max.
It's just, what can you do? What can you
What can
do?
you do?
I mean, I'm sitting here at home in my house in rural Oregon, 6,500 miles or what, 8,500 miles away from Iran.
Yeah.
And, and, with little, ability to influence government policy. And I think all of us are feeling that way. I remember marching against the Iraq War in Seattle in 2003, February 2003. At the time, it was the largest day of mass protest in world history. Something like 23 million people marching on the same day around the world against the invasion of Iraq. And feeling powerful. I was just a teenager, but feeling powerful, feeling like this is people power in action. How can they ignore us? And then they ignored us. And then they went in and they bombed Iran, and it was a fucking disaster for the planet. But they got what they wanted. They got Saddam out of there. They removed an enemy in the region. They replaced him with a client state, and they've still got a client state. And Iraq is not a great place. It paid a huge price for that expansion in power. So I think, like a lot of people, I'm just feeling I'm feeling bad about what's happening, and I'm reiterating my focus on uh, anti-imperialist action as being deeply linked to ecological action in the here and now. I think these movements are absolutely inseparable, and I don't think we'll be able to solve one problem without confronting the other. There's absolutely no way. Um, I might be interviewing Abby Martin at some point in the next couple months about her new film, Earth's Greatest Enemy, which is about the fact that, as I've mentioned several times during this show, um, the U.S. military is the biggest polluter in the world. And I haven't watched the film yet, but I've heard it's powerful and very important. So
That's
again, I
great.
just want to send my love and solidarity out to everyone who's listening, and all the innocent people who are being impacted by what's happening now, and the land. Shout out to my friend Calibri and other people who are doing writing and posting about the ecology in Iran, the bird life, the forests, the wildlife. Um, uh, they're all paying the price for this too, just like they've been paying the price for industrial civilization for a long time and all around the world. But war certainly makes that worse and worse and worse. So I wish I could end on a happy note. I keep trying to end on a happy note, Justin, but I just don't have it in me.
See, that's funny. That's funny.
Yeah, yeah,
And, I'm twisted, but that's funny.
yeah,
Because if you don't laugh, you cry, right?
yeah,
So maybe it's just the old defensive mechanism. But I really appreciate the discussion. I think it was fun having people be able to react
yeah.
and see different reactions from people who are reading. So
Okay,
thanks,
well,
Max.
thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.
We'll talk soon.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
See ya.